It is time for True Hoops' little Zoom from quarantine show. Very excited today with David Thorpe, and welcome back, Zachary Binney. How are you, sir?
Hey, I'm all right, guys. How are you?
Your official title is Assistant Professor of Quantitative Theory and Methods at Oxford College at Emory University. Your research currently sits at the intersection of sports and public health, focusing on sports injuries and athlete health. We're here to talk about the NBA reopening and the pandemic. Very glad to have you here.
Thank you all so much for having me. My pleasure. Glad to be back.
So they had the bubble with the most stringent rules known from COVIDdom and had total success with no spread of the disease. But now they're just reopening like it's fine. You don't need all that bubble. Like, what's the deal? Is this okay? Does the NBA look okay to you?
Most elements of it look okay, I think. So here's the thing. The NBA has a lot more information than they did when they initially set up the bubble. They've seen the experiences of Major League Baseball and the NFL in particular and have said, we think we can meet what they're doing. And yes, they had a couple of outbreaks, but they tamped them down pretty quickly. And Major League Baseball had a stretch of, I believe, 70-something days without a case, even though they were playing outside of the bubble. The NFL has had its cases increase recently in lockstep with the increase in cases in the US more broadly. But actually, if you look at the numbers and compare what's happening in the NFL, where there is frequent testing and limited time indoors and everybody's being generally really careful about wearing masks, even though some people will look at the numbers and freak out and go, oh my God, they're having 45, 50 cases a week right now. If you look at the rate at which people are getting sick in the general population and applied it to the NFL, you would expect to actually see about 100 players and staff getting sick every week. So that is to say that the NFL, even playing outside of a bubble, even with all their cases, their players and staff are getting sick at a lower rate than the general US population. So they are creating arguably a safe environment, safer than if they weren't playing and were just throwing everybody to the wolves during this time period, right? So the NBA, I would guess, I haven't talked to them about this, but I would guess that they've looked at that and said, okay, the bubble worked great in that we had 0 cases, but maybe 0 cases isn't the standard that we need to hold ourselves to. And it was not great for a number of reasons, like psychologically on players and families and cost-wise and things like that. So there are a lot of good reasons to not do a bubble if you don't feel you have to. And I suspect that the NBA has, taken this new data that other leagues have given them and is going with that. And I don't think it's a completely crazy idea.
That's a good standard. I don't think that it's a completely crazy.
Well, and I like how you put it too, Zach. It's safer, right? Who's to say what's safe, and the point of 0 being the only thing that's safe isn't necessarily obviously realistic. But I think your point too with the NFL anyway, which is a much larger group of people. Hey, if everyone makes responsible decisions, we can manage this. And I know from talking to people inside the NBA on teams, I think initially, Henry and I were talking a few weeks ago. I didn't feel that in talking to players. I felt it was more casual, but now I feel a real tightening, like to the point where if you're playing games in California, we can't do team meetings in California. There is a state law about 10 or less in a room. We all have more than 10. We can't just bring our starters in. So that's encouraging that they're trying to follow protocols that we all have been trying to follow, and many haven't done such a good job of.
Yeah, look, when Major League Baseball had the outbreaks on the Marlins and the Cardinals, after they had 2 in different divisions among teams who had no contact with one another, I was on team, this is not going to work. And they probably need to shut the season down. And I think it's important to understand or to admit when we were wrong.
Yeah.
When Major League Baseball's line was based, we've looked at our data internally. We're not sharing it, externally. So people like me, all we can do is make our best expert guesses based on what we see, what they put out publicly. Rob Manfred and all of them basically said, we're looking at our data internally. We think it's a problem of the Marlins and the Cardinals not following the protocols. And my response to that was, well, come on, what are you going to say though? right? That's literally the only line you can take to continue the season, is that this is something that we can
Right.
fix. So I was skeptical because that's what they had to say, but that doesn't mean it was wrong. And it turned out that for the next 74 days, I believe, they didn't have a case. So I think Rob Manfred was absolutely right when he said that. And then somebody let up off the gas actually in the bubble at the World Series, and some cases got in there, and you had some spread on the Dodgers, and you had the whole Justin Turner fiasco
Right.
the night they won the series. But they did really, really well for a while there. And so that's getting to your point of if everybody follows the protocols, can we really keep this thing under control and largely keep the virus out of the league? And I think MLB's experience in particular has demonstrated that.
So Friday night, I watched some preseason games, and there was a scorekeeper. I want to say it was in Portland. Middle-aged guy, seems nice enough, but he spent the entire game with his mask beneath his nose. And then I ended up talking to an NBA coach, and he was like, yeah, they're testing the players like 2-3 times a day in some cases. I was like, well, what about this guy? What about scorekeeper guy, who, for all we know, has been in a restaurant the night before? Maybe he's big with the nightclubs. I don't know. But the principle of this confuses me, because there could be a period where this guy would not test positive, but would nevertheless be a spreader. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. There's a very real possibility of that. And I just talked about Major League Baseball's example. Let me now talk about the NFL's example. As they've moved through the season, they have tightened things up, particularly as the season has gotten worse in the US, and they've had a couple of outbreaks on the Titans and the Ravens. So they're learning, and sometimes it takes people a little while to realize, you look around you, and if you're someone like me, you're like, how much more information do you people need to take this seriously?
Seriously.
Really, at some point, but like, it has to happen to you or someone next to you or someone in the league for you to really take it seriously. And the NBA may not be insulated from that. So I suspect, or I hope, what you will see is, as we move forward, things like that will get tightened up, and that scorekeeper will get a talking to and said, hey, you got to keep that mask up over your nose and mouth. And hopefully he's being tested with some regularity as well. But, you saw some lapses in mask discipline in the NFL, particularly among coaches and sideline staff near the start of the season. And that's pretty much gone away lately after some fines and stuff. So maybe that's what you'll see from the NBA. I don't know, but that's what I would suspect.
And then it struck me watching that same moment, which, to be honest, made me nervous. Like, I stopped enjoying the game because I was like, can we just get this guy's mask up? And then it became abundantly clear that this is an indoor sport played in much closer proximity than football and baseball.
Yep.
And, this guy, when, players waiting to check in are standing right next to him indoors and sitting next to him, a few yards away. And I was like, oh, it seems abundantly possible that there could be a bunch of infections at one game.
Sure. So we know indoor transmission is orders of magnitude easier than outdoor transmission. It'd be like playing a team of 8-year-olds versus an all-star team, right? For this virus, it's just much, much, much harder for it to transmit outdoors. Something that we're learning. And we also know that masks do a lot. So if you're outdoors and you're masked at least most of the time, and you're keeping your distance, that does a lot to cut down on the spread. Losing any of those, particularly moving things indoors, depending on the ventilation setup, because indoors isn't indoors, right? Like if the air is stagnant versus if it's getting moved around and circulated a lot and is being exchanged with fresh outdoor air, like that does matter a lot. Certainly. So depending on the specifics, it can get quite dangerous. One thing that is important for people to understand, and one thing that I think the NFL has actually bastardized a little bit, is this 6 foot 15-minute rule, where just because I'm 6 feet 1 inches away from someone does not mean I am safe. And just because I'm 5 feet 11 inches from them doesn't mean I'm in the death zone, right? It's all about keeping the distance as much as you can, more is better, and minimizing the amount of time that you are near someone else. There's nothing magical about 15 minutes, right? If I walk up to you and make out with you on the street for 30 seconds and I have COVID, guess what? We were only within 6 feet for 30 seconds, but you may very well have it right now.
But a
right?
magical 30 seconds, Zach.
There was a magical 30 seconds. Thank
because
you, Henry.
because we're talking about viral load still. They still think the amount you take in is what's going to impact whether or not you get infected with it.
Sure, we know that's part of it, and it's just a numbers game. The more time that you spend, the closer that you do, the more air you're exchanging with
Right.
someone else,
Right.
and that's really the key. A lot of the general communication around COVID and what you're supposed to do has been very muddled and confusing, and that's in part because it's a new disease and we're learning a lot. But also, I think we haven't really given people kind of a pithy slogan in this country that they can use. We've given them 6 feet, 15 minutes, and that helps a little bit, but it really doesn't describe the most important thing. Like in Japan, they invented something called the 3 Cs to communicate. At least that's what it translates to in English. It's crowds, closed spaces, and something else. But it's a very easy thing to remember, even though I'm only remembering 2 of the 3. But the point is,
calamari. Everything's better after calamari.
But the one that I've heard that I've really loved is from Dr. Michael Osterholm at the University of Minnesota, and they've recently launched a campaign on this. It's called Stop Swapping Air. He said it on Meet the Press a few weeks ago, and I was like, oh my God, that's what we've been missing. Stop swapping air. 3 simple words. Anything you can do to not be sharing your air with someone else, that's the key. Masks help with that. Distancing helps with that. Being outdoors helps with that. Stop swapping air.
I think you want to talk to us a bit about the idea of fans in the stands.
Well, I assume you guys were interested in that as well.
Yeah.
Look, I was dead set against fans of any number when the NFL season started. What has been really upsetting to me is the anarchic way in which basically the people who are willing to be the most aggressive have gotten what they wanted. So the NFL took a very hands-off approach, said, listen, whatever your local authorities will allow, whatever your owner wants to do, that's what we're going to allow. And so what team in the NFL has had the most fans? It's the Dallas Cowboys and Jerry Jones, who has an indoor stadium. Yes, they can open the roof. Yes, they can open the doors, but you still have enclosed concourses. It is not the stadium you want leading the way. Okay, it's just not. You want an outdoor stadium leading the way. And I've been reflecting on this over the last couple of months because the NFL will say, we don't have any evidence of spread at an NFL game. And that's true as far as it goes, but absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, right? Because we have a completely overwhelmed testing and contact tracing infrastructure. Right. I don't know that we would have identified an outbreak at one of these games. Did we miss a 5,000 person outbreak? No, I sincerely doubt it. We probably would have caught that. But a couple dozen cases at a game? Yeah, we could have missed that pretty easily. What I would have felt a lot better about is if teams were kind of taking the route that Europe took with bringing back fans and with reopening certain venues. They actually did a scientific study of a concert venue with about 4,000 people in Germany. And they tested a few different manipulations over a few different nights to see what really affected potential COVID transmission in a venue. We didn't do anything like that, right? If the NFL had come to me and said, listen, Zach, we're looking at the data. What we're seeing is that it's really hard to transmit it outdoors. Can we start with 2,500 or 5,000 fans in a few cities with outdoor stadiums? And we're going to fund, fund contact tracing or set up some sort of system of our own to follow up with as many of our fans as are willing, at least on a volunteer basis. And we're going to aggressively follow up and see if any of them got sick. And if with a reasonable program like that, after 2 weeks, we didn't see anything, okay, now we want to go to 10,000. Another 2 weeks, okay, now we want to go to 20,000. All right, that would have been one thing, because that would have been setting up a scientific program and testing it. I still may not have been in favor, but I wouldn't have hated it as much. And at this point, if we didn't see anything, I would have said, listen, 25% in an outdoor stadium, if people are mostly wearing masks, does not seem to be a big risk at transmitting for COVID. That's very possible. Now, if we're getting into the NBA, though, now you're talking about indoors, right? Can't play outdoors. Totally other beast. Not comfortable with any of it. And the most disturbing thing that I've seen is that there are different regulations for people sitting within 30 feet of the court and 31 feet or more away from the court. What that says to me, surprisingly, given the NBA's generally careful attitude with everything else, is that they care a lot more about fans transmitting it to their players and staff, and they don't care nearly as much about fans transmitting it to each other, about presenting a public health threat to the broader community. And that's really upsetting. That's unfortunate to see. You know, the other question that I get asked a lot about is, okay, when could we have people back at NBA games? And I have two answers to that. One is we have the vaccine. Let it start working its way through the population. And once we get to decent herd immunity, right, maybe 60, 70% of people either vaccinated or having had natural infection,
Right.
Can talk about having fans back indoors. Okay, that's going to be a few months. Maybe it won't be until the 2021 playoffs. Okay, but we're all, let's not screw it up any more than we already have now for something that's just not necessary. The other thing is the Warriors plan, which their owner has brought up, the plan of rapid testing of all fans before they enter the building. Problem with that is he's allowing people to get tested up to 2 days ahead of time. So that just tells you they weren't sick 2 days ago, right? If rapid PCR tests, reasonably accurate rapid PCR or even antigen tests, get to the point where we could run them on you, like when you show up to the arena, and we can get you a negative test and send you through the gates, I think then I would revisit my opposition. But until we can get the vaccine-based herd immunity or rapid tests at the gate, I'm against it.
Right, right. Is there any kind of filtration that could exist that would convince you otherwise? Like, I know they have some pretty fancy air filtration going on in some of these buildings.
Yeah, I'm not an HVAC expert,
Yeah.
so I don't necessarily want to comment on that. But we do know that ventilation is a huge deal. We don't seem to have a lot, if any, spread on airplanes.
That's what I was just going to ask you. Yeah.
Where you're going to be a lot closer than an NBA arena.
Right.
So if people are wearing masks and if you could get airplane level air circulation, I mean, exchanging with outside air every few minutes, if you could build up a system like that, potentially. But then you still want to think about the risks and the benefits of any step back towards normality, right? So you have to argue to me that the benefits specifically of having fans in an NBA arena outweighs any risks. You don't have to make that argument to me. I shouldn't say that. We have to make it as a society. I don't have any power over this.
I had this interesting, I mentioned this somewhere in something we published on Hoop, but a guy who's been in the NBA a long time was like, look, if you have a courtside seat, it's worth a lot, not just because you get a good view, but because you get on TV. So like celebrities will pay extra for it just to promote their movie or whatever it is, right? Like now with this in mind, he's often asked people, what's the value if you only had one fan in the whole arena? How much do people pay for that? Because now you dominate the broadcast, right? And his point was that the Knicks make the most money of any team with about $3 million per home game in arena revenue. And he's like, you could charge $3 million and have one fan. Like, my bet is you would get just as much revenue from this one ticket as from all the arena. So like you could have a $0 loss with just one fan. I was like, well, you know what? The next few months, not a bad idea.
Who do we think would pay $3 million
Oh,
to be the one Knicks fan?
There's a lot of billionaires out there.
There are.
It's a micro analogy of who would buy a team, right? Like Mark Cuban without the Dallas Mavericks is just a boring software dork, but now he's the co-host of a show, of a primetime ABC show, right? Like it makes you famous. People pay a lot for that.
True.
And,
That's an interesting idea.
Companies would do is advertising for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I think there's a chance that you get like Ellen Pompeo will sit there when Grey's Anatomy is coming back on ABC.
Right.
You know, you could even do Well, I don't know. Once it gets to those numbers, maybe then you're not as interested, but you could even do like 10 for 300 grand a pop.
See, now you're in the business. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, that's fine. And that's fine, right? 10
Yeah,
people, who cares? It's when you start getting into the thousands
yeah,
that it worries me.
yeah, yeah. Well, and to be honest, you don't have to replace $3 million in most cities in the NBA, right? Like it's 800,000 or something, or a money loser in some cities. Um, yes. Okay.
And there are the stadium staff and people to think about as well. I don't want
Right.
people to think that I'm ignoring those people because that is a very real concern. It's just frustrating that we could take a rounding error from virtually any federal agency and make these people whole for months, every single one of them in the country.
Yeah.
Yet we have proven ourselves unwilling to do that. So then the choice becomes, do these people starve or do we create a public health threat for the community when that's just, we're the richest, most powerful country in the history of the world. What is that really our only choice? We put a man on the moon and we're backing ourselves into this corner. It's stupid.
I wanted to ask you that, and Henry, if you want to say this for later, just when I'm done, just say let's talk about it later. But knowing what we know, you made a point earlier about what the NBA has learned, what Major League Baseball and the NFL have learned, and from each other, and the NHL, not just their own stuff. But where we are right now, Zach, and what you've learned, if you could if we had a time machine, and we could only go back to, let's say, March the 10th. How would you go about, and you were the czar, you were in charge of everything. How would you have done everything differently so that we didn't lose 300,000 plus people and also wreck an economy completely, which I'm not saying that's happened, but what could we have done much differently knowing what we know now?
I think the single biggest thing, I mean, if you gave me a magic wand,
Yeah.
I'm trying not to get too political on your podcast, but
Go for it. Let her rip.
No,
It's fine.
whatever.
I would
Tell us.
let me say this. I would have a chief executive in charge who did not take every viral case as a personal insult and affront to him and his leadership. That's really the biggest thing. Look, there were screw ups top to bottom, but it really does start at the top. And that made it incredibly difficult for the CDC to do their job. It made it incredibly difficult for experts to communicate what they needed to communicate to people. It politicized the virus so that there were issues with, in some sectors, with getting mask adoption. And there just wasn't, look, when you have a new disease like this, communication is incredibly difficult because the experts, and I don't even count myself among them, right? I'm just a sports injury epidemiologist. I'm not
Right.
an infectious disease doctor. I'm not an MD. I'm not Dr. Fauci. So I'm trying to be, a little careful with
Yeah.
my language here, but we were all learning. And that can be really frustrating for people because it seems like the message keeps changing. And if you don't have a unified, especially if the message is changing, if you can't get unified communication out there, it's very difficult to do in the best of circumstances, and it was nearly impossible based on what we had now, or based on what we had then. So that made it really difficult. There's a tendency to get frustrated, an understandable tendency for the public to get frustrated when it seems like the story keeps changing. That's learning. It got called flip-flopping in the 2004 election, and that
Right.
has really stuck,
Right.
where critical thinking has now and learning has now become flip-flopping, and it's seen as a point of weakness when it should be a point of strength.
A great point.
But that said, right, again, it's still frustrating if you keep hearing masks don't work. Now masks do work, right? I think that was certainly a mistake on the part of the public health community, but they learned. The line has been out there for months now, but it's still been difficult to get out there because of some of the political ramifications and the political divides. So that's one thing. I would have had somebody actually in charge, and we should have acted aggressively. We should have worked more on testing. Now that we have the vaccine, it's still important to work on testing, but that's the focus. But in the meantime, while we were waiting for the vaccine, that should have been midterm thinking, and we weren't thinking about the short term where we really needed testing, and we needed a unified national lockdown briefly in order to get the virus under control and then keep it under control. The other thing that I would have done is I would have prioritized a more holistic intervention and response. So there was a lot of focus on the virus and on testing, and there wasn't nearly enough focus on economic support, right? Sure, we got the one-time checks, we got the unemployment insurance kick up, those were good. We needed to pay businesses that we knew would spread the virus to stay shut, and we didn't.
I was waiting for you to say that.
And we didn't. We didn't.
Yeah.
We did the PPP. That was good. It needed to be way bigger, way longer term. And we just gave up on that. I don't know if because of ideological divides
Right.
or whatever. But if I just ask you as a business owner, right? I say, you got to shut down your business. And by the way, we're not going to make up your lost revenue. We're not going to make you whole. You're going to have to fire a bunch of people. Like, are you going to shut down? If you own a restaurant or a bar, that's a really hard ask.
Right.
Right. And I don't think these are bad people necessarily who are doing this. They're people who are being thrust by an uncaring society into an incredibly difficult choice. And they're making, honestly, a perfectly natural choice. So we should have recognized that economic health is part of health. We should have given people the support that they needed. And we also should have had more rational prioritization of things that should have reopened. For example, do you want schools or do you want restaurants and bars? A lot of areas, state and local governments who rely on the tax revenue from restaurants and bars elected to open those before schools because they were getting hammered by tax revenue and weren't getting any state or local support from the federal government. So then you had all of these horrible choices of opening up the most dangerous places because they produce a lot of tax revenue for cities, and it just ended up being a mess. So I would have had somebody in charge who gave a damn, and I would have made a more aggressive economic response.
Zach, you were on my mind actually. Last time you were on the show, basically we can, probably we can pick. You have like a budget for a certain amount of contact, and you can pick schools or bars, and that just kind of stuck in my head. And I happen to live in a town with hardly any bars, and they're all closed. And we do have schools open, which is pretty nice.
It's good.
I was wondering, so I thought on this December 22nd NBA restart, and I was looking at like Santa Clara County and then San Francisco and the ways that the municipal governments were handling gatherings in this resurgence of the coronavirus. I was like, oh, the NBA is going to get shut down. But it seems, because, like David said, in California, you can't even have 11 people in a room to have a team meeting. But you can have, it turns out, like the 40-odd staff of the visiting Brooklyn Nets visiting the 40-odd staff of the Golden State Warriors, etc., in a special exemption in an arena for a game, which seems, well, how does it seem to you?
No, it's a really good question. And I'm of two minds on this. So one is, I think it sends a really questionable message to everyone else, right? Like, why can the Warriors do this, but nobody else can? But if you take another step and you think about what is the difference here? I mean, just scientifically, I'm not talking about any message to the public. I'm just talking scientifically. These are people who are being tested regularly, right? So we're reasonably confident that they're not infected, they don't have the virus. If we could do that to everyone, right, then we could have a lot more gatherings and we wouldn't have these limitations. So in these environments where there is regular testing, it scientifically makes a decent amount of sense to allow these folks to get together, even if you're not allowing others. Now, is it incredibly depressing that we've basically have pro sports and some college teams having this testing capacity and normal people don't? Yes, that is depressing, and it's frustrating that we seem to have decided we're okay with this, right? We're not saying this is a temporary state of affairs. Look, people would love the psychological boost from having sports back. It's okay to divert a small, very small, I mean, less than 1% of the tests that we're doing nationally. We're going to kind of allow sports teams and leagues to use this, and that's okay because we are going to be ramping up to 20, 30 million tests a day or something like that. But that's not what we decided to do. So that's a little bit depressing and frustrating. But that's why you're seeing the difference and why it's okay for the Nets and the Warriors to get together and play a game while normal people can't gather.
And let me ask you this: so if you, let's say you run the Atlanta Hawks, I guess that's your local team, right? Or any team, you're effectively a 40-odd person rolling bubble, doing your best to stay safe from hotel to hotel around the NBA. And it strikes me that and we haven't really had published numbers of how many positive tests there have been, but it's conceivable that on some NBA teams, it's more than half of your 40 have already had the coronavirus.
Right.
Like from the known cases, we're close in some cases. Can you achieve herd immunity in your little pod bubble of 40 odd people?
I mean, yes, that certainly shouldn't be your goal. But I was
Right.
definitely disturbed, or except through vaccination, I was definitely disturbed by the number of players and staff who reportedly tested positive when people started returning for practices in preparation for
Yeah,
the season.
54 or something like that.
Right, and it was like, was it 9% or something
Yes.
of people tested positive? I mean, so that's high a little bit for one reason that doesn't really mean that much, or basically you can't compare the first round of testing to subsequent rounds of testing, because that first round of testing, assuming that it was all diagnostic tests as opposed to antibody tests,
Right.
which I actually don't know for sure. Antibody tests detect past infection, but assuming we're talking about current infections, these are infections that people could have picked up anytime in the prior 2, maybe 3 weeks, right?
Right.
And you could still test positive. So there's a longer period of time there. Whereas if you're getting tested, every other day, then you're only getting a round of infections from the last couple of days. And maybe players weren't being super careful during the off season. Maybe they were blowing off some steam from the bubble. So they were putting themselves, or their families were putting them in riskier situations. And maybe now they'll tamp that down now that started. I don't know. But that's certainly unsettling. Is it possible half a team could have been infected by now? Sure, maybe. But so far, my understanding is we're not seeing huge numbers of cases now that the season hasn't started, but now that they're into kind of that ramp up and that, hey, we're going to be more careful period. So we'll just have to see what happens from here on out.
Their last reported round, it became just steadily down. So it was, 9%, and then a dozen plus, and then just one in the last week. And the last
Sure.
number they reported.
Sure, and that makes perfect
University-
sense. And I don't think it's herd immunity. I think it's people are now being more careful.
Right, they're following the protocol.
Right. Because I was asking that question more as like, if I ran, let's say, the Hawks, you're unbelievably worried about the day-to-day of your job, right? The numbers are so sky high, and you do have to eat and survive and go through airplanes and everything. You're putting these players at risk. I was just wondering if, like, so I would be tempted to be the guy who runs around the whole time being like, put your mask on, wash your hands, like, open the window. Like I would have that temptation, but I was just sort of wondering if you have a team where I think it might actually be the case that there's some teams where out of the 45 traveling party, like they already know that 23 of them have already had it. I'm just wondering if, like, is that a big enough number that, the person in my role there could take a break?
Well, so that still leaves you 22 people who can get infected, right?
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Herd immunity is all about slowing the spread, right? It doesn't stop other people from getting sick. It's about stopping that exponential spread that destroys health systems and just gives us too many cases at a time and results in a whole heck of a lot of mass death on a country level. So I would still be worried about, especially if some of my stars hadn't had it yet, right? I would be worried about losing them. I would be worried about losing other people from contact tracing. And I would still be worried about the potential for some spread through those 22. You do have fewer what we would call vectors, right? You have fewer ways for the virus to get into those 22 people because 23 of them have already had it. But if you still have contact between the wrong people, you could get that spread, and that could cost you some people for a game. So I don't think you should give up. Herd immunity on a team is not immunity for everyone. It means that you won't have a 30-person outbreak because there aren't 30 people left to get sick. But you could still get 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And also, you know a lot about this effect of this on athletes. I talked to Christy Oshmondon, who I think you also know, and
Yeah, Christy, great.
Yeah. So Christy was pointing out that there was like a college freshman athlete who died of COVID. But it does seem like by and large the direct effects on these very fit young athletes seems to be that the vast majority of them are fine. Has that been your impression too, or no?
So a couple things.
Yeah.
One is, yes, the death rate in young people is quite low, and that's good. If you see a lot of young people get infected, this is actually something I taught my students just a couple of weeks ago. If you have a lot of chances for improbable events to occur, you will see them happen, right? We know this in sports stats all the time, right? You have uh, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games. You're going to find some really weird stuff happening in those games, right? Just because improbable doesn't mean impossible, right? So you will see some people die and they may get a little bit of outsized attention. That said, there's a lot that we don't know about future ramifications of the virus, and it's not all about death or you're fine. For example, I'll share my wife's story because she's talked about this publicly. My wife was infected a few months ago over the summer, and her taste and smell still aren't right. Like she can't use normal toothpaste, it tastes like gasoline.
Wow.
She can't have a burger, it tastes disgusting. Like it really affects her quality of life. So, how many players and staff are suffering from these effects? We don't really know how common they are, but it's a lot more common than death. So, we should be careful to not just say you're dead or you're fine. There's a whole lot of in between.
I don't know how to think about that college basketball player who collapsed, and there's been sort of a
Yeah,
notion
I
of
really
it
don't want to
to COVID.
speculate on that because we just don't have any information on that.
There's
It
no
could
way
be an
knowing.
unrelated heart thing. It could be COVID related. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, that's what they're saying is that it could be a lot of different things. That there is my son was in the game. He plays on the other team, and it was horrible to watch. But he right away started getting feedback because some of his teammates know that guy well, and I guess there's some history of other stuff. It just opens up the Pandora's box of what you're saying. There's just so many questions. But I was curious what Henry was asking you. Is that something you're going to be factoring in your job? University of Houston announced this week all 15 of their scholarship players have had COVID. Everyone. So and we can only guess how many. It's going to be a big percentage. It won't be 4% of Division I college basketball players, for example. It's going to be a big number. Is that something you'll start being able to track if teams will make that public and you track that going forward for potential, pro NBA, that kind of thing?
Well, sure, if teams are willing to share the data, and it's not just teams, it's leagues, and there are also medical privacy
Yeah,
concerns, right?
right.
I don't get access to players' medical records just because it would be cool, right?
Right.
There's a lot of ethical safeguards in place for good reason. So I really don't know what happened with Keontae Johnson. I don't want to.
No one does. Nobody does.
Yeah, again, maybe his doctors do, maybe not even them yet. But certainly, we do know that myocarditis can happen, though I think, generally speaking, and I don't mean to undermine that case in any way, but
Yeah.
I will say, I think the fears of it were overblown relative to the data that we actually have. Because here's the thing myocarditis happens with other viruses as well. We don't know how often it happens in younger people after, say, the flu, because we never thought to measure that. Who cared? Nobody ever cared. Nobody ever did a study of these people. So we don't know if it happens essentially at the same rate
Yeah.
in the flu and COVID. We don't know. That said, it is certainly incredibly important for all players to have a thorough cardiac evaluation before being allowed back to sports activity. And hopefully that will catch cases of myocarditis and we will deal with those very carefully. And those players will not be allowed to resume athletic activity until those are resolved. I think that's basically what we're doing now and seems like more or less the right way to proceed.
That's what Houston's doing. Exactly that. They're testing every player. They've already tested, I think, because some of these guys had it in the summer.
Right.
Is that the primary concern, myocarditis? Are there others on the list we should also keep our eye on?
We don't know. There have been some potential for long-term lung effects,
Yeah.
long-term neurological effects, certainly taste and smell. I mean, that doesn't really stop you from playing necessarily, right? It just reduces your quality of life substantially. But those would probably be the main things right now. But we just don't know because the virus has been around a year,
Right.
right? So if you ask me what happens 2 years after you get it, I literally can't tell you that. That knowledge doesn't exist.
Exactly, want you to know the future.
Well, too damn bad.
They need to send you and a lot of other people like you to Japan for the Olympics, because there's going to be a whole lot of athletes playing, I bet, that have had COVID.
I bet they will. And my hope, look, I don't treat players.
Yeah, I know,
I
but
just
you can
analyze the
give the
data.
information.
But
Yeah.
they should, yeah. I mean, certainly it is something to be wary of. But if we do the scans and a full cardiac workup and people, and medical professionals sign off on it, I think that that's okay. I don't think we need to be prohibiting a return to activity for anyone who has had COVID-19. I think that would be an over response.
Um, and we know that it's theoretically possible to get COVID twice. Is there any? I know the research has been disappointing, I guess, or it's a vague here, but could the second infection? What else we know about that at this point? Anything?
Yeah, no, I don't think the research on that has been disappointing. So again, let me go back to improbable events. If you
Right.
give them enough chances to happen. You will see these. By all accounts, it is extremely rare. Extremely rare. I mean, 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000. It's very, very rare so far. Confirmed true cases of reinfection with COVID-19. All the news I've seen about that is excellent. So we really should be able to take a step back and kind of look at everything and realize that along with the vaccine is some genuinely good news. Sometimes there's a little bit of a tendency to go digging for negative information where there shouldn't be, just because this is such a horrible situation. But there really is no negative information on that. I'm quite confident in the extreme rarity of reinfection. And that actually brings up another thing that I'll talk about briefly. Can we talk about vaccines?
Yeah, let's do it.
Very briefly. Okay. So I got a push notification to my phone a couple days ago from the New York Times saying, "Oh my God, a healthcare worker in Alaska suffered a serious allergic reaction
We got it. Yeah.
after the COVID-19 vaccine," right? And I was so mad at that headline. Look, I'm not saying don't report on this,
Right.
okay? But you need to put it in context, and you need to not have screaming headlines that scare the crap out of people, because these allergic reactions, they are rare, and they happen with literally every vaccine, literally every one. Okay, this is not new to the COVID-19 vaccine. This is not a factor of making the vaccine too fast. This does not mean it's dangerous. Okay, that's why, if you've ever noticed, when you go get a vaccine, like say you go get your flu shot every year, you ever notice how they tell you hang around for 15 minutes so we can keep an eye on you? At least if you're in a doctor's office and you're getting it, right? That's because they're waiting for a possible allergic reaction. This is not new. So we need to put this in context and recognize that rare events, they happen sometimes, but they are still very rare. Reinfection and bad reactions to the vaccine both fall in that camp.
Right.
Like
We can call this the Dwight Howard effect. He can shoot. If he shoots threes enough, he'll make a three once in a while.
There you go.
It isn't
Exactly.
a strategy that we should be based on if you're rooting for him to win a game.
I love it. I love it. The
I feel
Dwight
like
Howard effect. I love it.
Everything about this story to me is about visualization. Like we have a hard time understanding things we can't visualize. Like for instance, if we could see the virus, everybody would understand masks like that, right? Like, or if we could see how many people got the immunization with this one, we could see the one in context of a big visual, like an infographic. You'd be like, yeah, okay, there we got one. There we go.
Yeah,
Well-
no, I think that's a great point. People really struggle with both very large numbers and very small numbers.
Right.
But that's why the messaging, going back to something with the brilliant stop swapping air, I saw an animation from electron microscope of the virus, the airborne virus, not one water droplet, trying to navigate through a typical surgical cotton mask. And the New York Times wrote about this and said, it's like traversing 1 mile, like a mouse or something going 1 mile. That's how much fabric is it just in your typical cotton mask. And yes, some will get through, but many get caught up on one of the cross fibers. And my family, we double mask to make it 2 miles of different obstacles for something to travel through.
Sure.
Seeing that animation, I mean, I was wearing masks before, but it made even more sense to me than before. That the communication messaging as well as visual messaging going back to my original question of how we do things differently, that is something that like we can't take. I've always been upset about social distancing. It's physical distancing, social connections, physical distancing. So then we are addressing the loneliness part of it.
Yeah. No, agreed 1,000,000%. Look, science communication, communicating your findings is at least as important as doing the science itself. Because if it stays in the journals or people don't believe it or people don't understand it, it's not doing any good. So I agree 1,000,000%. And I love those animations. And there have been,
Yeah.
sometimes there's a little bit of pushback from the scientific community on this is oversimplified or this isn't quite correct. But also, like sometimes you do have to oversimplify in the
Right.
interest of communicating to people, and that's okay. That's okay. I
Right.
love that analogy. I'd never heard a mouse walking a mile. That's great. I
Yeah.
love that.
The part of me was like, wait, is there a mouse in my mask?
We've got rats at my dad's house. Actually, we just had the exterminator over to
Oh,
trap them,
geez.
so they're on my brain.
It's it's an alarming situation to be in. Right? Yeah. It is. What's the right? So it's felt a little bit at times where the NBA has not published their guidelines. We don't know what their protocols are. Like they have a 42-page restart media guide, which I just did Control F. It doesn't use the word COVID. It's like they're like what it's all about. Like, oh, Greg Popovich is back. I'm like, who gives a shit? Like we know Greg Popovich is back. There's a pandemic, but in that environment, it feels to me like they have a little bit of the ability to make up the rules as they go along. Which is why I'm asking you, like, what is a good protocol for bringing someone in? Like they sign a new player, someone's been out of the protocol to go to a funeral or a wedding or whatever. Hopefully not a wedding. What sounds good to you for the rules of bringing players back?
Yeah, I think that what we've learned, in particular from pro sports, actually, I think this is a really interesting point. Pro sports has provided us some of the best data on time to test positive and incubation period, time till you develop symptoms of anywhere in the world.
Great.
Because we're testing these people constantly.
Right.
And when you shut a team down when there's an outbreak, you know when that last contact was, right? You know, and you can start counting from there. And what we've seen is that, or what I've seen at least, is that very few cases show up more than about 7 days. Okay. The CDC's initial guidance, which has been shortened now,
Right.
it was initially 14 days because this was for people who couldn't get a test. This was wait to see if any symptoms show up because they can show up that late. But by and large, you seem to test positive by about day 7, day 8, if you want to be careful. Okay. So I think it's okay if you're testing people regularly, 7 days where you are quarantined and kind of acting like you would as a member of the team. And then if you test negative at day 7, kind of bring you into the fold. I think that seems okay.
Okay, that's good.
And the CDC has actually changed their guidance on that, right? They've shortened it, I believe, from 14 for everyone to 10 days or 7 days plus a negative test.
Right. Are you, we had Michael Mina on this show, and I know he's gotten a lot of attention.
Oh, yeah.
Talk us through your views on rapid tests and their powers.
I've always thought Dr. Mina had a wonderful idea and a wonderful point. I still think he does, though the speed of the vaccine, I suppose, I would say, has undermined that slightly, right? I think we still want to be making investments in that, but if we can get everybody vaccinated within the next few months, then any huge testing advances after that will hopefully be moot. I wish he had been in charge or in a position of authority in our initial response.
He tried.
I'm sorry?
He tried.
I know.
When we had him on, he had already talked to senators and congressmen and been in the New York Times and been quoted by Thomas Friedman and us.
I know. He was taken.
Gladwell talked about it on this podcast. Yeah. And
he was taken very seriously by a lot of people, but unfortunately not the ones who are actually in a position to make this happen.
Right.
The federal government. And so, that would have been really useful a few months ago. I think it could still play a role, but just with the vaccines coming, if we can just kind of hang on and everybody can be careful and stay at home and be responsible, and we could shut down bars and restaurants for just a few more months, we're nearly there. We just need to avoid killing each other in the meantime.
Be nice. That's a nice idea. What's the okay? So let's say that the Golden State Warriors Stadium is full of 20,000 people in June. How many of those 20,000 people have to have had a vaccination or the virus for this to be an okay situation?
Yeah, so I guess you could go a couple ways with that. One is you could require some kind of proof of vaccination. I mean, if you got proof of vaccination, then fill it to capacity,
Mhm.
right? If everybody's vaccinated, that's most okay. The other thing you could do is make sure that your area, the whole community that you're drawing fans from, is at, maybe 75% to 80% either vaccinated
Yeah.
or have had the infection.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. Because then, and maybe you still encourage very old people to stay away until 2022 or something like that, right? But at some point, once we get to that point, we're not risking the exponential spread. And I think it is a little bit of, you know, okay, like we got to live with this. You can make your own choices because you're not putting the entire community in danger anymore once we get to that point. Could we be at that point by June? I think that's pushing it. The line that I've been saying, and I know this is an NBA podcast or a show, so I'm sorry, but the line that I've been saying is the 2021 NFL season could very well look more or less normal.
Yeah.
I think that's the timeline we're operating under. And certainly the 2021 to 22 NBA season will look more or less normal. I feel quite confident in that.
And I'm such a football idiot, but that season starts when?
That would be so training camp would start late July. The season would start in September.
So close. That's pretty
So,
close. Yeah.
yeah, less than a year. We're talking late
Yeah.
summer, I think, where many of us will really start to feel comfortable with totally opening up things like arenas and stadiums again.
Okay. Sounds good.
We're on the way, folks. We're on the way. This is not a permanent thing.
Yeah, it's not a lifestyle. I mean, it's not
Before-
getting like
before we
like,
bring
it's
in-
just how we live now. Yeah.
Before we bring in Gerard, I would love to your point about messaging, and we're so close to the finish line here because of vaccines. In military jargon, sometimes you hear talk of you don't want to be the last one on the last mission out before there's a peace agreement, right? We need to have someone talking about just what you said. Now, I just gave this speech to my family. Like we're months away, 4, 5, 6 months for people in my family to get it. My parents will get it quicker, which is good. Let's not screw up now. And,
Right.
and there's more virus outside than ever before. We've never had so much virus around. This is we can be patient for a few more months because the end is near. The peace agreement's about to be signed.
I think it is really important to make sure that people understand there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Fear mongering, saying things will never go back to normal. This is not actually helpful
No.
at this stage. It's not. People need to understand we're there. We just need to hang on. People need to be doing better than they are right now, but they only need to do it for a little bit of time, and we can save so many lives.
Right.
Sounds good. Gerard Hector, are you available?
He's
I
there.
am here. Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Hello,
Perfect.
Gerard.
I blocked
see
you
you
with the
again.
chat. Sorry. Let me move. There we go.
Watch me on the chat. Nice. Zach, this is great. Thank you for joining us again. Athletes physiologically, particularly pro athletes, right? Like are clearly different than like your layperson. Like,
Excuse me. Excuse me. What are you trying to say about me?
that includes all of us on this call. But have we seen anything, or are there going to be sort of studies and looks at the effects on them in particular? Because as we know, I mean, look, anybody losing 2% of lung capacity is a problem, but a pro athlete losing 2% of lung capacity, that can mean the difference between, well, now you're not a pro anymore because
Right.
and that's your livelihood now, right? So is there anything going on there with that? And then two, you mentioned earlier, you don't get access of records just for fun. So what would be, if you could get access, what would be things you'd be looking at to do?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I am not involved in any of these studies. I'm new on faculty at Oxford, so I'm mostly focused on getting my classes up to speed right now. But I think that studying the long-term effects on athletes would be really interesting and really valuable, and being able to track like, hey, what is your VO2 max after the disease and things like that? Are you losing lung capacity or the ability to perform physically above and beyond what we would expect from natural aging? Right. I think that's really interesting. I think following up on the myocarditis issue is going to be really important. And you said it, right? It's that if I lose 2 to 3% of my lung capacity, it doesn't really matter. The most strenuous exercise I get is a 40-minute run or standing up in front of my class and talking for an hour. But it can mean the difference between a career and no career for an elite athlete. And that's another reason why we don't just want to think about death or you're fine. There's a lot of gradations in there. Let me also say one thing briefly. This is just a fun little story that is, I promise it's sort of related. So a couple of years ago, I was at a sports analytics conference in Vancouver, and me and some friends and colleagues went to do a hike called the Grouse Grind, where you go up like a mile or something like that at some insane grade. And there were 4 of us. There was me. I was working in baseball at the time, so I was representing baseball. There was Mike Lopez, who's now the head of analytics for the NFL. There was the head of analytics Pittsburgh Penguins, so he was hockey, and there was the head of analytics for the Boston Celtics. There was basketball. Mike and David from the Celtics smoked me and Sam. So for the record, football athletes and basketball athletes are much more athletic than hockey and baseball. That was the message that I took from that hike.
It's awesome.
I know that guy, David Sparks, right?
David Sparks. Yes, I was blanking on his last name.
Fantastic guy. Yeah.
Oh, I love David.
Yeah. That's
Wow.
hilarious. And fit, turns out.
Very fit. I think he would have smoked Mike if he had actually taken it to him.
That's
Great
funny.
call.
Yeah. I'm sure you're fit, but the NBA, what NBA players go through, and then you figure that they're so tall and so long. You know, I saw Henry this the other day. Their wingspans. You know, if most people, if they're 6 feet tall, have a 6-foot wingspan, and if you're only +3 or +4, you're not NBA standard. +5, +6, +7. That these guys have freakishly long wingspans, probably because their fingers and hands are long. But so I think about that with hearts too, and COVID. To Gerard's point, that kind of stuff, you know, it's on my mind as a coach.
Well, then
For sure.
you think about too, right? And again, the literature isn't out yet because you haven't done the study. What are the effects on recovery for quote unquote non-related injuries, right? Because since it's all connected, since the body's all connected, okay, I've had COVID and I lose percentage of whatever, but I'm still playing. But how does that impact my, I don't know, ACL recovery or what?
Right.
Yeah, there's so when Marcus Elliott was on the show, he's like a Harvard Medical School doctor, you know, whose primary area is preventing sports injuries. But he said, you know, we had him on as the bubble was about to begin, and he was basically saying, I think we understand this molecule of the virus well enough to understand its effects on athletes. And he gave me the impression he just wasn't that worried about it. And I've always been like, ooh, I wonder what he knew. Like, I wonder why did he say that? I don't know why he would say that, but
Interesting. I mean, look, different people are going to have different perspectives, especially at this stage, and we're just going to have to see how it shakes out. But look, I know, for example, Major League Baseball has shared a lot of its data with CDC and has resulted in some publications from that, and that's been incredibly helpful for learning. The NBA has certainly worked with Yale and has contributed a lot of data. I hope the NFL is sharing their data as well. There's a lot of people who would like to help on this issue, and the leagues are, again, a unique source of some of this longitudinal data over time, where as long as players give their permission and the league is okay with it, there's just a lot of data there that I think a lot of people would love to get their hands on to figure out what's going on and how we can help not just athletes, but regular people as well.
So Zachary, super unfair question to close. What are the odds this NBA season goes off okay? That we don't have it derailed by canceled games and the like?
Well, define derailed, right? Are they going to get to the end of the season? Greater than 90%, I would say, just because they'll bowl through one way or the other. Will you have teams that shut down? Will you have an outbreak with the sheer numbers we have and based on what we've seen in other leagues? Yeah, probably, but I think they'll bowl through.
Okay, I'll take that. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Judy. Thank you, David. Thank you, Gerard. And we'll see you again soon, Zach.
Be safe, everyone.